Hi, everybody. I am in here testing out a new software. I know it'll take a little bit for people to file in, and I didn't really announce this ahead of time, but I'm actually testing out a new software here today in order to see if we can do more live events on here. So I would love to. One of the plans is to actually set up a live event going into the end of November, where it'll be all about the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant relationship for about an hour. And for today, this is sort of the test run. So I will share. Hello, hi Manny. I will share a little bit of content for today just to sort of test this out. We're streaming live. I have something called Restream on here, streaming through Facebook as well. So I'm sort of doing a little dry run today, a little test to make sure all the technical stuff works. And I will probably, for this video specifically, just do about 10 minutes or so of content. And then we'll do a full length webinar going into November all about the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant in relationships. So if you would like to, if you are tuning in live, hello and welcome. You're welcome to ask me any questions in the meantime, but I'm actually going to just dig into sharing a little bit of intro content today about some really important fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant dynamics. So we'll start by talking a little bit about the FADA relationship and how it starts off, and how the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant together can sort of be drawn to one another. And then I will go into talking about some really crucial points to heal this relationship dynamic, because it's very easy for this relationship to start off on a strong note and then over time to start having some problems and challenges, especially as we see this dynamic move into the power struggle stage. So we'll talk a little bit here today for the next 10, 15 minutes or so, and then I'll open up the floor for lots of questions if you have any. We'll talk a little bit today about what the DA experiences in this relationship with an FA and what the FA experiences, and then we'll talk about some of the different core wounds and fears and how to communicate and work through those different core wounds and fears. So if you're tuning in live, hello and welcome. I see more people joining in here. Thank you for all these wonderful comments already. Thank you, Manny. That's so sweet. I'm so glad to hear that. Hi, Maxine. And please feel free to post some of your questions. Hello, everybody. And I will circle back to them. So I'm going to go through this short presentation, and then I will circle back to some of the questions towards the end of this. And we'll try to stay on the topic of like FADA dynamics or any FADA questions you have. And we'll do follow-up versions of this for the APFA, etc. So sometimes what you'll see when you first have the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant get together in a relationship is they often start off being very drawn to one another. They tend to have a lot of traits that are different. And one of the things that we know drives attraction biologically, one of the top three factors that creates attraction to each other, is something called trait variety. So if you can imagine years and years and years ago when we were out trying to survive in the world, and if you had somebody who was really strong pair up with somebody who was really smart, because they had unique traits that were their unique strengths, when they paired up together, they were more likely to survive. And so there's actually three big factors that drive attraction, like what actually makes us feel attracted to other people at a subconscious level. And that's one of the first ones, where often, if you ever hear the phrase opposites attract, what it actually means is that people with different traits, we are biologically wired to be more attracted to, because it actually increases our chances of survival when we pair up or attach to those individuals. So this is one of the things you'll see a lot in fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant relationship dynamics. The honorable mention, if you're curious about the other things that also drive this attraction, the top three things besides that trait variety piece are people who represent our subconscious comfort zone in the relationship to ourselves. So, for example, if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of criticism, and then maybe you internalized that criticism, and then you became somebody who was really critical in the relationship to yourself, then what actually ends up happening is consciously you may be like, oh, somebody that I'm starting to date or speak to is quite critical. And you may feel consciously that that's not a good thing, but your subconscious mind is actually wired for familiarity because it equates familiarity to safety. So your subconscious mind might go, well, actually, this is familiar. And it's really important to remember your subconscious mind is the one running the show. It's responsible for 95 to 97% of your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions. And your conscious mind is only 3 to 5%. So we're really wired to be attracted to people who essentially treat us the way we treat ourselves. And the way we treat ourselves often comes from internalized childhood patterns. So, what we were exposed to a lot growing up. So, going back to this, we've got trait variety. We've got if somebody represents the subconscious comfort zone in the relationship to self, it's a big part of what we feel attracted to. And then number three, we are often attracted to people who meet our deeply unmet needs. It's one of the big reasons that we can fall into limerence with people, right? If you are in a dynamic where somebody makes you feel really seen and you always felt unseen as a child, and somebody comes into your life and they make you feel really seen or really heard or really validated or protected, and that's something you were yearning for growing up, this is where I most often see people fall into limerence. So with the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant, their major part of attraction to one another is actually the trait variety part. So you'll see that they tend to have these unique traits, these sort of big differences. So they feel really drawn to each other from that sort of attraction point of view. Also, I will jump in here and just answer a couple of quick questions. Thank you for sharing, Paris. I'm so glad to hear that the videos have helped you. And I love this. And you said, I'll just read this out loud. Your videos have really helped me and my DA stay together. We kept fighting and having breaks. Me as an AP never understood each other. Now we are functional for the longest period ever. I'm so happy to hear that. And I know that that means you put in a lot of work in the process. And I also see hello to Sarah and Abhishek, hello. And Diego says, are FA cheaters during the relationship? I would say that in general, insecure attachment styles are obviously statistically more likely to cheat than a securely attached person. However, it's not necessarily FAs that will be, it depends on the stage of the relationship. So we talk a lot about on this channel the work of Dr. Susan Johnson. I know she talked about the 5 stages of a relationship, and I've sort of separated out the first 2 into not just the honeymoon stage, but the dating and then the honeymoon stage. So if you look at the different stages of a relationship, we have the dating stage, the honeymoon stage, then we have the power struggle stage. And if we make it out of the power struggle stage, we get into the stability, commitment, and bliss stages. And what you'll generally see is actually people cheat at different stages. Statistically. So you'll see, for example, dismissive avoidants are more likely to be unfaithful or not settle down or cheat in the dating and sometimes going into the honeymoon stage. But generally, in the power struggle, it's going to be the fearful avoidant who's a little more likely to cheat in that stage, because the fearful avoidant has these big needs for closeness, but then this huge fear of being rejected or abandoned or betrayed, and so they'll push away. So we may see a bit of an uptick there. And we'll see anxious preoccupieds across the different stages more likely to have emotional affairs, right? So they may have feelings, they may sort of have this ongoing emotional connection. They may not actually cross the threshold of cheating as much as you would see from a DA and then an FA. But it sort of depends on the stage that you're in more than anything else. And I do want to say really importantly that it doesn't mean that all of these attachment styles are going to cheat, right? It's not that everybody, when they get into the stage, cheats who's a DA or an FA. It's just, you'll see it sort of differentiate out between the different stages. So really, really great question. And a lot of what like fosters, I'll try to stay on track with the presentation. I love the discussions in here, but I think that it's really important to recognize that when we look at cheating in relationships, the root cause of cheating in relationships is actually about somebody having unmet needs and then not knowing how to communicate those needs. So over time, it becomes resentment. So what I'll generally see in terms of like the path that will cause people to cheat is somebody will have unmet needs in the relationship. They don't usually have the emotional literacy to talk about their needs, let their partner in, let them know that they're missing something. And then because the subconscious mind is a needs meeting machine, it's designed to literally try to get your needs met. What can happen is you have different individuals who have these unmet needs. Then they start feeling this sense of like being unfulfilled in the relationship. They don't go to their partner to have the discussion. And instead, what happens is they start feeling resentful. They're like, why isn't my partner meeting my needs? What's going on? Do they not care about me? They start giving meaning to it and creating stories. And all of those stories build these invisible walls between themselves and another person, between themselves essentially and their partner in this case. And over time, then it's easy to justify cheating. So then if somebody comes in and does meet your needs, let's just say the example is your partner's not making you feel seen or heard or understood. And then you feel this distance from them and this resentment about it, but you don't know how to tell them or how to articulate that. Then if somebody comes into, let's say, your workplace and suddenly they make you feel very seen and heard and understood, you might start going, well, geez, this person cares and my partner doesn't care. And we give meaning to it. We tell stories, and it kind of like can push somebody over the edge in that case. So there's a lot of reasons for things like that. I'm definitely not saying it's okay to cheat or it's appropriate, but what I am saying is that it's really valuable when we understand the mechanics of how these things happen, because we can put up these preventative measures to that, right? We can say, you know what, I'm going to make sure that my partner and I are really good about communicating our needs in the relationship so we don't ever have to get to that point. I'm going to make sure I build emotional literacy around my own needs and make sure that I'm practicing communication with my partner as well so we can maintain a healthy dynamic there. Hi, Brett. How are you? So Brett says, thanks for the chat. I believe FA and QBPD, quiet borderline personality disorder is what that means, have shared traits. What is the difference between discard and or devaluation between the two? It's actually a fantastic question. And then I am going to go back to the presentation. I'm supposed to be talking about FAs and DAs, but I just want to chat with everybody in here. So, some of the big things that you'll see when it comes to borderline personality disorder versus a fearful avoidant attachment style as a whole are a few really core components. So when we look at, and I'll tell you like the general form of this, and then we'll go into, Brett, as I'll tell you some of the quiet to BPD versions of this. So you'll see that when we look at borderline personality disorder from the DSM perspective, one of the first criteria is that there have to be these really frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So there can be this like huge effort. With a fearful avoidant attachment style, one of the first things you'll see is fearful avoidance may have an abandonment wound, and they may do things to avoid abandonment for sure, but you won't see the same extreme degree of this like frantic effort to avoid abandonment. So individuals with BPD tend to display more of this like very extreme fear of abandonment, and they may have these more magnified behaviors that are a bit more impulsive, clinging to relationships that are even unhealthy. So you'll see that. The second major criteria that you'll see that differentiates out BPD from FA is that there's a big identity disturbance for individuals with BPD. So individuals with BPD have a very unstable sense of self, sort of this like emptiness in terms of like knowing and understanding who they are. Whereas a fearful avoidant attachment style will tend to have a much more stable sense of self-identity. So fearful avoidance may have a lot more interpersonal relationship issues because they still have a lot more core wounds, but they'll generally like know, maybe what they want to do for a career, or they'll, have a job that they're invested in. They'll usually have some friendships that they're connected to. They'll have some hobbies that they're interested in. Whereas the individual with BPD, they tend to be so relationship centric that literally it feels almost impossible for them to have a sense of self outside of the relationship, which means they tend to derive their sense of self from a relationship, which is part of why it feels so severe and so scary and overwhelming if somebody were to abandon them, because they feel like they lose themselves if they lose that person, because they've really enmeshed the two. So that's one of the other big differentiators you'll see. You'll see more impulsive and more risky behavior in BPD individuals versus somebody with FA. FA attachment styles may still have a little bit more core wounds, a little bit more impulsive behavior than, for example, a securely attached person, but you'll see a more extreme version of this in individuals with BPD. And then some big ones that tend to really differentiate the two are somebody with BPD may have more suicidal or self-harming behaviors present, even if they're just sort of suicidal thoughts, gestures, threats. And sometimes you'll see the person with BPD even like talk about that. If they're thinking that somebody may leave them in the relationship, those things may come up for them, those big fears. And so we'll see that. Whereas with fearful avoidant attachment style, that's much less likely to exist there. Fearful avoidance can have a lot of emotional turbulence, a lot of anger or frustration, but we'll generally see a big difference there between BPD and FA. And then we'll see as well that there can be a dynamic of stress-related, sort of paranoid ideation, or even like more severe dissociative symptoms with somebody with BPD, and less so with somebody who's just a traditional FA. So an example of this, I don't necessarily mean like extreme paranoia, but I mean that the stories that somebody has about what's happening can be really disconnected more often from reality. So you may see, for example, that somebody with BPD, I'll tell you a story actually. I had a client once, and the client was in her mid 20s or so, mid to late 20s maybe. And she was living with her roommate, who was a female who was interested in women. And she was living with her partner, who was a man who was interested in women, and they were together in a relationship. And the her partner and the female, they got along fairly well. They were friends, but her roommate was not interested in men. But I remember in one of the early sessions I had with her, as I was sort of doing discovery work with her back when I was running my client practice, she was saying like, I'm scared they have something going on. They get along, they're interested in each other. And like her female roommate was like only interested in women, nothing else, no interest in men at all since she was a very young child, like her whole life. And so you could see sort of how like that's where we kind of cross the threshold into more like, and I asked her, like, did you see texts to suggest that? Have they said things to suggest that? Like, do you have any sort of like evidence to back up that fear? And she didn't have anything. And that's where we kind of cross the threshold into like um just a little bit more on groundedness of things, right? There can sort of be a little bit more paranoia where it's not as connected to facts. It's not like, she saw some sort of like really flirtatious exchange or some text to suggest that or anything of that nature. So that's where we're really looking at some of those big differences. And that's where it's also very valuable to pay attention to that. So anyway, so those are some of the big differences. And then we'll see a lot of these same things just more internalized. Like when we look at the quiet BPD, one of the differences there is that with quiet BPD, you'll generally see that the person with quiet BPD has the other dynamics of BPD, like explosive anger, things like that, internalized towards self. So that's like where you'll see the quiet sort of variation of borderline is that there will still be these unstable and intense relationships, but it'll be more withdrawn. There will still be all these like, pieces of identity disturbance, emotional instability, but a lot of this person will have all of that who is quiet BPD directed within themselves. So the big outstanding features are still those major ones we talked about with between fearful avoidant and BPD or quiet BPD, which is like less frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, less identity disturbance going on, less chronic feelings of emptiness, less paranoia or paranoid sort of ideas about things based on stories. And you'll see as well that there is somebody who's much less likely to self-harm. So those tend to be some of the 5 kind of major differences in there. So really, really great question. So I will go back here just for a moment to some of the FADA relationship dynamic and talk about some of these features, and then we'll all come back in and have the discussion and do some Q&A. So you'll see that early on, we'll see the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant be drawn to each other because of trait variety more than anything else, and sort of this like opposites attract dynamic in many ways. And the dismissive avoidant tends to be really drawn to the supportiveness and warmth of a fearful avoidant. And they tend to like the lack of pressure because in the dating stage, fearful avoidants tend to be very independent. So they tend to sort of just have fun, keep things light. They tend to not want to jump into a commitment too much right away either. And this tends to allow the relationship to kind of thrive more in the dating and honeymoon stages. But where we'll see the fearful avoidant, and I think this is really important to remember. I probably don't say this enough in the YouTube videos in general, but it's really important to remember that we won't really see the attachment stuff come up based on what our attachment style is or someone else's attachment style is until we've actually attached. So, what I mean by this is, before you've really been vulnerable and built a bond and really sort of made that attachment, you're not necessarily going to see everybody's attachment behaviors, right? You're not necessarily going to see a whole bunch of different attachment patterns come online. What you'll see for the fearful avoidant is once the fearful avoidant gets feelings and really has this sort of sense of vulnerability, now you'll start to see more of those fears of abandonment coming up and things of that nature. And dismissive avoidants won't generally start to shut down and pull away a little bit until they start to develop more feelings and their own feelings make them feel vulnerable and overwhelmed, right? So early on, we can actually see kind of the best sides of a person. Best sides, everybody's on their best behavior kind of idea. technically really people's best sides come out if they make it out of the power struggle stage, because there's more depth and awareness and vulnerability, and we've sort of learned lessons that we need to in order to bond in the relationship. But we won't see the attachment wounds come out so much in the dating and honeymoon stage until sort of later into that honeymoon stage we start to build more of that attachment. So the things, and this is really interesting, the things that the dismissive avoidant tends to be most drawn to in the fearful avoidant attachment style is they tend to be very much drawn to the empathy of the fearful avoidant, the presence, the feeling of being supported, cared for, acknowledged. These tend to be big unmet needs for the dismissive avoidant. And so they'll tend to be really drawn to those things. And dismissive avoidants tend to really want in a relationship, they really want acceptance. DAs, I think one of the things that sometimes goes left unnoticed is DAs tend to be quite accepting of their partners. Like they won't try to change their partners. Um, and that tends to be like, if I had to say the way that a dismissive avoidant receives love in a relationship, for DAs, love is things like support, empathy, acts of kindness or acts of service, sort of in that love language venue, and um, empathy and acceptance. So these tend to be the really big things that we'll see. And fearful avoidance tend to really do a good job of doing that. And fearful avoidance tend to also be good at making people feel seen and heard and understood, which also is something that a DA is often yearning for in a relationship. Now, on the flip side, what's really interesting is the things that fearful avoidance tend to be really interested in a relationship is they tend to be with a dismissive avoidant is they tend to, and I think this is something that goes unnoticed, fearful avoidants are the attachment style that puts so much pressure and expectation on themselves in all areas of life, but including in relationships. And dismissive avoidants tend to be very accepting of fearful avoidance, like they're not trying to change them or make them do anything or make them become something, and they won't really like judge the fearful avoidant. They kind of let the fearful avoidant be as they are. And what I find that often a fearful avoidant will report with a dismissive avoidant is that they feel this sense of safety in that. They feel this sense of being able to be themselves more and kind of open up a little bit more. They feel this sense of acceptance from their partner, and they feel this absence of pressure in that relationship, which allows the fearful avoidant to sort of express more who they are. And that tends to be a big unmet need for fearful avoidance, is the sense of, just absence of pressure, absence of expectation, and this deep acceptance. And so these tend to be things that really draw one another to each other. It's interesting as well, because this will actually appear in FADA friendship dynamics as well. The things that each of these styles tends to appreciate about one another as friends. And then once that really big bond has been built and that attachment is there, that's where we may see things start to unravel, right? Because now, once they've attached, now the fearful avoidance wounds will start coming up, and the dismissive avoidance wounds will start coming up. And namely, what those big wounds are is the fearful avoidance big wounds are often around being abandoned, especially because they have a more DA partner. So that's going to polarize the fearful avoidant more into their own anxious side. And, being betrayed, feeling unworthy or unimportant or unseen can come up in this relationship dynamic as well, especially because we know when the dismissive avoidant has their wounds come online, they're afraid of being trapped. They're afraid of being unsafe, which is a big wound for dismissive avoidance, which is very interesting because dismissive avoidance, really tend to avoid conflict and emotional. This is one of the biggest threats in this relationship dynamic is the emotional volatility of the fearful avoidant can be something that the DA has a really strong flight response to. And the hard part of this is often what happens too is in this relationship, fearful avoidance will often be more hurt by the dismissive avoidance actions, whereas dismissive avoidance will be more hurt by the fearful avoidance words. So, what I mean by this is when a dismissive avoidant doesn't call back or cancels a date night or cancels something at the last minute, those actions or inactions, right, are things that will really hurt the fearful avoidant. So they will then respond often with criticism, right? Because fearful avoidants aren't the best at being vulnerable. And what tends to take place is when we don't know how to be vulnerable, then we often criticize, right? You can hear the difference between something like, you never do the dishes, you don't care, versus, hey, I could really use some support. I'm a little overwhelmed with work right now. Can you take a turn doing the dishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? Like if we communicate what we need in the positive, That lands so much better than if we tell somebody what they're not doing. But the more adverse we are, or the more afraid we are of being vulnerable, the harder it will be to actually communicate that way to somebody. And so you'll see this a lot with fearful avoidance, where they'll communicate through criticism because they don't know how to say, hey, I need support. I'm experiencing overwhelm. I'm feeling, tired. They won't know how to open themselves up and be vulnerable because it was never modeled to them. So what we'll see is where the threats start coming online, and the challenges in this relationship is the DA's actions will hurt the FA. The FA will respond with critical words. The DA, when the words are critical, will withdraw further. And now we have this like vicious cycle, right? Where where you can see the dismissive avoidant does something that hurts the fearful avoidant. The fearful avoidant communicates it in the negative instead of communicating what they need in the positive. Then the DA shuts down more. Then the FA feels more hurt or abandoned, becomes more critical. DA shuts down more, and it can just go around and around like this. And so these feelings of push pull can start to really take place kind of in the later honeymoon stage of this relationship, or at least as soon as that attachment bond has really been built. And so what starts off in this case of things going really well in the dating and honeymoon stage, and everybody feeling like they're on their best behavior and everything works, and it's simple, and they both respect each other's need for freedom and autonomy and independence. Often, as soon as there's that closeness, the DA starts feeling unsafe in the conflict. They start feeling afraid of being trapped or helpless. And they really have a big shame wound, a really big fear of feeling defective or being seen as defective. And so, what you'll then see is that defectiveness fear, right? Is when the fearful avoidant criticizes the DA, they have this huge I am defective core wound. It comes online, and they just need to pull away more and more because that's how they self-preserve, right? That's how they sort of protect. So I'm going to give a couple strategies in a moment about what we can do if we want to work through this dynamic. I just want to dig into a couple other questions in here. Um, um, and so this is a really interesting question. So here's the question I'm on right now that I just scrolled to is um let's see. Okay, well, there's a few really good ones in here actually. So one of the ones I see is, if you feel an instant attachment to someone on site, what is that called? You know, I do think that there's a lot of reports of people saying things like love at first sight, all those sorts of things. And I'm interested in that. I'm definitely open to those ideas. And I definitely think there's like a spiritual sort of aspect to life that maybe it could fall into that category. But what's really interesting is that sometimes when we have this instant attachment to somebody, what's happening when you look at like how your brain works is your subconscious mind and unconscious mind collectively are picking up to 1 billion bits per second of data or information. Your conscious mind is picking up, like, so all this data comes into your subconscious and unconscious mind up to 1 billion bits per second. So much data, so much information, and only 40 to 60, not 40 to 60,000, just 40 to 60 bits per second of data make it to your conscious mind. So I think a lot of what's happening is, we're picking up on all of these cues about somebody and forming this web of information where we're picking up all of these cues based on how long somebody maintains eye contact towards us, how open their body language is, their micro expressions, their tone of voice. We're picking up all of these things really quickly about a person. And I think a lot of time what happens is we'll pick up on these things about somebody, and it reminds us of our own subconscious comfort zone, or it reminds us of, we see that somebody's expressing a trait that we don't feel we have access to. So that trait variety thing that we talked about at the beginning, one of those three major features that drives attraction, that can really take hold of us. And I think that's a lot of what's being picked up on. And then it sets the stage for limerence, because the biggest root causes of what will cause somebody to feel limerent is trait variety. And if somebody seems to meet an unmet need that we have, or the third one was if somebody represents our subconscious comfort zone. So I think there's a lot of that. And I've often found that people, when they feel this like instant attraction and this sort of limerence piece, those relationships, although the connection feels so strong, are actually sometimes the hardest ones to work long term. So it's really important to take a look and evaluate, when we're feeling limerence, and what might actually be there. And I've often worked with people when I was seeing clients for a long time. I was helping people that were in limerence get out of limerence and get into healthy relationship behaviors. Because if you stay in limerence, some of the downsides are that, you're more likely to be in a trauma bond. You're more likely to be codependent. When you're in limerence with somebody as well, you're less likely to express your feelings and your needs and your authentic self to somebody, because you've got them on such a pedestal. You're so worried about not being accepted by them. So, I'd help people get out of limerence and into sort of their being able to be grounded and express themselves truly in a relationship. And that's when the relationship could work. But if somebody stayed stuck in limerence, it was actually much less likely to succeed. So really, really interesting question there. And thank you, Sheila, for your nice comment. And hello, Antoinette. Welcome from South Africa. Very cool. Then Ethan says, hi, Ethan. Someone told me that secure relationships will create secure attachment. Is it possible that insecure means you're just not in love? How can an FA like me reflect on their true feelings? Great question. Sometimes fearful avoidance really go back and forth as well. I know when they're dating, they may feel like, do I like the person? Do I not like the person? And your feelings can feel really strong in either direction. And there can be a lot of ambivalence there. And I want you to know, Ethan, that often ambivalence itself is actually about having deeply unmet needs. So in childhood, and then those deeply unmet needs going into a space where you also get, as a fearful avoidant, you're wired to have two meanings about love. So for fearful avoidance, love, it can be a beautiful thing and a really connected thing and something you really cherish and yearn for as a child. And often in your upbringing, love can be a really scary thing and confusing thing as well. So fearful avoidants have competing associations about the same thing, being love, right? Competing associations. Love is good and love is pain. And so what happens is, if you believe two completely opposite things about love, you're going to constantly feel pulled in different directions. And if you combine that with unmet needs, then you're going to feel like you're in a position where, and if you don't know how to communicate those needs to your partner or know what your needs are, you're going to end up going back and forth with people you're dating and not really know, like, do I truly like somebody? Is this love? What am I really feeling here? So you said someone told you that secure relationships will create secure attachment. I disagree with that. I strongly disagree with that, to be quite honest. If they're, because here's the reason for a couple of, I think I actually put a video on about this yesterday, or maybe it comes out tomorrow. But the idea is that, you can't just date somebody who's securely attached and has secure habits and then fall in love. And the big reason being that one of the big things that drives attraction is our subconscious comfort zone around love. So you can be a fearful avoidant, and your internal subconscious comfort zone is probably, like, internally, what the messages you got about love growing up might have been: love is good and love is scary. And you might have felt like, okay, love is chaotic, or connection is chaotic, and I have to walk on eggshells. And so you have all of this, like, subconscious comfort zone for what love is supposed to look like to you. And if somebody secure comes to you and you start dating them, it's actually very unlikely statistically that fearful avoidance will stay attracted to securely attached people until fearful avoidance do the work to become secure themselves. And now you've got a secure subconscious comfort zone. And remember, we keep talking about this on this channel, but if you haven't seen it in a video before, our subconscious comfort zone is the relationship to ourselves, right? It's like our subconscious wants that familiarity because it sees it as safety. So if we grew up, the example I gave earlier, in case you weren't here, or for anybody who wasn't here at the beginning, the example I gave is, if you grow up in a household, let's say, that there's a lot of criticism, we'll often internalize that criticism, become critical of ourselves, and then we'll actually, unfortunately, be attracted to other people who are also critical to us. Our conscious mind may know better and be like, wait, that's not healthy. But our subconscious mind will be like, this is familiar and we've been surviving, so this is working. So let's go back towards this criticism. And so it's really unlikely that a fearful avoidant will be attracted to a securely attached person unless you're reconditioning, reprogramming your subconscious comfort zone internally. And so insecure attachment, you'll see, doesn't just mean that you're not in love. You can be in love with somebody, very in love with somebody, but have your fearful avoidant patterns on really strong that may even act as a saboteur to a relationship. And in fact, I would actually argue that the more your feelings are there for somebody, the more unstable it can feel, the scarier it can feel if you still have all of your fearful avoidant core wounds. And so what often takes place is, if we've got these big core wounds, the more vulnerable we feel to somebody or the more in love we feel with somebody, AKA the more vulnerable that will feel to a fearful avoidant, actually the bigger the magnification of our core wounds can become. So it's a really great question, but I would definitely say the answer would be to work on your internal attachment style, do that attachment style healing and work. And then you'll be able to also not feel push pull dynamics from love because you won't fear love, right? There won't be this deep subconscious fear of being trapped or unsafe or, in an unhealthy relationship dynamic that you might have seen in the past that your subconscious may be holding on to and projecting onto the future. So, a really, really, really great question. And I also see a question from Mindy. I don't understand the difference between a DA and an FA. Can you elaborate? So, some really common differences are first and foremost, fearful avoidants will be very present when you meet them. They tend to be very present. They tend to make you feel really seen. They tend to, really care about connection. They tend to be really deep and emotionally available to others. However, the caveat is that fearful avoidants won't necessarily share themselves as vulnerably. Okay. So they'll dig into others, they'll ask questions, they'll talk more about feelings and dig into some of those things than you would see in a typical dismissive avoidant. But fearful avoidants may not share things that are truly vulnerable to them as much. Fearful avoidants also have different wounds. So some of their big wounds are actually around betrayal, feeling unsafe. Fearful avoidants have that anxious side to them. So they can still have these big fears of abandonment or exclusion or being alone or rejected or disliked. And then they have their own betrayal core wounds. And then they still have some of the big core wounds of the dismissive avoidance. So they can also fear being trapped or helpless or powerless. But for dismissive avoidance, they don't really have the anxious core wounds, right? And you'll see as well, fearful avoidance, when they feel triggered, can either activate or deactivate. So if a fearful avoidant feels triggered, they can try to get closer to somebody by calling or texting or trying to do things to bring the relationship closer. But dismissive avoidance, they will almost always deactivate. So when they are triggered, they will try to heal from that trigger or solve for that trigger by going inward and pushing away and withdrawing. Whereas fearful avoidance, they can do that, but they can also get this need to really cling on or hold on tight to somebody or resolve something right away. And generally as well, you'll see some fearful avoidance be more likely to be a little more emotionally volatile in relationships. They tend to be really hot and cold. Whereas dismissive avoidance, they tend to be a little more pervasively withdrawn. So those are, some early differences. There are more, but hopefully that gives you quite a few to start sort of seeing one of those differences in there. Robert says, "You're not going to pick on Bob's today, are you?" I'm sorry, Robert. Bob is the PDS mascot inside PDS. Nice to see you, Robert. And thank you for these. Hi, Sarah. And hi, Dee. And Chopper says, also DAs being compulsive with lies. I actually tend to find DAs, as a general rule, um, are more likely to be very honest, kind of blunt, not caring what other people think, sometimes like too honest in a way. So you'll see a lot more of that kind of dynamic. But what you will also see is a very small portion of DAs can have other issues going on. But if they're compulsively lying, that's actually more than an attachment style issue. That may actually be more associated with something called the dark tetrad. So, without going too far down the rabbit hole, because I'm still going to give some fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant relationship tools here in a moment. Some of the things that I will often see, essentially, if you've ever heard of the ocean model, it's the 5-factor model of personality. And if you look at the ocean model, it's one of the basically it engages things like the trait of openness, like trying to see how open somebody is, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So these are like traits that can be used to sort of measure a person's personality. Like if somebody is very open and very extroverted, but then also very neurotic, you would see, some sort of output of that personality and what that might look like versus if somebody's very conscientious and neurotic, but then not open, you'd see like a more of a rigidity in their personality. So there's these major traits. And then eventually psychologists came along and they said, well, these don't measure all of the traits that are meaningful. There's also the dark tetrad traits. It was originally the dark triad and eventually it became added to and became the dark tetrad. And the dark triad measures something known as Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy. So those are the dark triad. And then sadism was added to that. And so Machiavellianism is what's really relevant here to compulsive lying, which is sometimes we can see individuals and it doesn't necessarily put them as a narcissist. They can just have like these really high traits from the dark tetrad in terms of Machiavellianism exclusively. But you'll see some of the differences. Machiavellianism is very sneaky. It's manipulative. Like people with this trait will lie a lot to get their way, to manipulate other people through flattery or deceit. So you'll see that tends to be more associated with Machiavellianism as a trait. We can also see people compulsively lying because of big relationship fears, different issues. But when we're talking compulsive lying, it's often as a means to get needs met. So you'll see that's sort of the Machiavellianism part. If you look at some of the other traits, if you're curious, narcissism is more like attention seeking. So the narcissism traits in the dark tetrad are more associated with things like I constantly need attention. I want to be the center of attention. I seek, status and prestige. Like you'll see those kinds of dynamics under narcissism. Then with psychopathy, one of the big differences there is it tends to be more associated with um, like no remorse. So no empathy for other people, no remorse, a big callousness, like an insensitivity to people's feelings, a lack of like regret if they do something harmful or hurtful to people, like they don't really feel anything about it. So these are other like personality traits that can be separated out there. And then sadism, which is kind of one of the scarier ones, is if somebody actually takes enjoyment in seeing other people hurt or through people's pain, right? So then we have we've got the five factor model over here, and then we have the dark tetrad, which has all of these other kind of unique dynamics to them. But this is where we get into the measure of like unhealthy personalities. And so, when we look at FADA, they can each have their own attachment style wounds and challenges. But when we're talking about compulsive lying, that's not actually associated with any attachment style in general. So when we're talking compulsive lying or some of these other traits, that's actually that person could be whatever attachment style, with the exception of secure. But then have maybe this trait over here that's more Machiavellian, right? So you may see some of those different dynamics. Really, really interesting question, and definitely something to pay attention to, right? Like if you're seeing compulsive lying, that would absolutely be a really big red flag in the situation. So, um, so I will dig a little bit deeper into some of these FADA dynamics here for a few more moments, and then I'll maybe answer another question. So essentially, with the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant in a relationship, some of the different wounds that you'll see come up are the fearful avoidant when they start getting into that power struggle stage. The fearful avoidant will start fearing abandonment from the DA, and they may do things like test the DA to see if they care. The fearful avoidant will give a lot of intermittent reinforcement to their DA partner because it represents what they're feeling inside. They're feeling hot and cold and confused about the relationship, and they may really push the DA away to test to see if they care, because they have a hard time understanding how the dismissive avoidant can be so kind of like calm, cool, and collected and can want their space so much. And what's really interesting about relationship is we tend to, as people, we all project from our perception. So we all tend to think that people would be and feel as we would be and feel, right? So we tend to think, well, if I would be in a situation where this would bother me, why isn't it bothering that person? If it's not bothering them, they must not care, right? So for example, let's say the fearful avoidance dating the DA and they aren't feeling like they're spending enough quality time together. The fearful avoidant, rather than understanding, because this is the human condition until we research about it, the fearful avoidant will often go, well, if I didn't want to spend more time together, it would mean I don't care about the person. So this person may not care about me. Rather than, oh, the dismissive avoidant has their own unique needs in a relationship. And for them, spending time once or twice a week together may be more than enough to keep them fulfilled because they're wired differently from me. So what we'll see is the fearful avoidant really starts to personalize the DA's behavior in a relationship and fears this abandonment. And then they'll start testing, and they will also tend to feel betrayed. I think there's a big difference between privacy in a relationship versus secrecy. That's its own topic of conversation. But dismissive avoidance tends to be quite private. But when we see something that's secretive, that's where we get into red flag territory. But a fearful avoidant needs transparency in a relationship. They really need everything to be above board. They want to understand why people do the things that they do. The more transparency is there, the easier of a time a fearful avoidant has with trusting somebody else. But what we'll see is, the FA will often mistake the dismissive avoidance need for privacy as secrecy and then not trust them. So we can have all these like kind of dynamics that start coming up in the power struggle between these two attachment styles, where they feel being, they fear being betrayed or having the wool pulled over their eyes or being abandoned, and they will struggle to trust. And one of the biggest triggers I'll see as well with a fearful avoidant is fearful avoidants really don't like feeling ignored or disrespected. And sometimes they'll feel very ignored or disrespected in this relationship dynamic. So sometimes if the DA is kind of dismissive and the FA is trying to engage and make a bid for connection, and the DA is kind of dismissing it, that can be something that really, really gets under the fearful avoidant skin. And they may push their partner away because, again, the fearful avoidant wouldn't ignore a bid for connection because that's not how they're wired, right? Now, on the flip side, what's really interesting is the different wounds that will come up for the dismissive avoidant are they fear being shamed and criticized, right? And if you actually pay attention, dismissive avoidance, a true dismissive avoidant, somebody who doesn't have any other challenges going on, so no other like attachments, or sorry, personality disorder issues, things like that outside of just their attachment style. Dismissive avoidants rarely criticize people. They tend to be more careful with their words, because for them, words hurt and they sting and they land differently. If you're ever dating somebody who's like really, you think they're DA, but then they're really mean or harsh or critical and they kind of tear you apart with their words, there may be something going on there beyond just dismissive avoidant attachment. So, when you see like our typical DAs and they're, fearing being shamed and criticized, or feeling not good enough, what they'll start doing is they'll just start pulling away, and they don't understand that the fearful avoidants wire differently. They don't understand that fearful avoidance, they're not often hurt as much by words, right? Fearful avoidance can kind of understand that you may say things you don't mean when you're angry, and that's fine. Fearful avoidants are really looking for that investment. Like, are you showing up? Are you spending time? Are you initiating connection and spending time together and planning things? And so there can be this kind of like mismatch of understanding here. So some things that are really important for each of the attachment styles. Number one, both attachment styles need to learn to communicate. If you're in the power struggle stage as a fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant, it's really hard to get through the power struggle stage and allow the relationship to progress into the stability, commitment, and bliss stages unless you're communicating. And so fearful avoidants need to ask their DA partner for a few things. They need to say, quality time is important to me. They need to set the standard of a baseline of time that is workable. That may be like, we spend time together 3 nights a week or 2 nights a week, sort of bare minimum. They need to communicate to the DA in a healthy way. They don't need to say, it's really important. They don't go, you never spend time with me. You don't care about me. But instead they frame it and they say, I would really love to spend more time together. I care about quality time in a relationship. It's part of what makes a relationship work best for me. And it's something I'm looking for in somebody I'm dating. I want to set a baseline of like twice a week. I don't expect it to be perfect. If there's ever an urgent matter that pops up, maybe that changes and that's okay. But I want that to be the standard that we really try for. So the more you can communicate in the positive rather than in the negative, like about what the person's not doing or what they didn't do, that goes a very long way in this relationship dynamic. Another thing that's also so interesting is dismissive avoidance, they really need to hear when they're trying. They really need to hear positive affirmation about it. So if the DA then does really try to do those, 2 nights a week and really makes the effort, they need to actually be encouraged. And I saw this a lot with couples. One of the big reasons and sort of challenges here is that dismissive avoidants don't have a lot of modeling for a healthy relationship. Dismissive avoidants don't have a lot of like modeling to see people exchange needs, right? Because a lot of DAs grew up in a household where there was a lot of emotional neglect or unavailability. So they didn't see this. And so DAs often, like when I would do a lot of one-on-one sessions, a huge portion of my clients were DAs. And DAs would say all the time to me, like, Thais, like my partner's doing, my partner's asking me for these things. How do I know if I'm doing it right? I did it like this. I tried to do this thing. Is that even right? Is that what they're looking for? And DAs have a huge wound around feeling incapable, or stuck or frozen. So, when you can instead share like what you're needing, and then when you can, validate when you see it, DAs thrive and they work so much harder in relationships when you positively reinforce them. When you say, "Hey, I notice you're really trying to make an effort with the 2 nights a week. Thank you." So the more you're appreciative and acknowledging when you see change, it goes such a long way. And then another really big thing that will help in this relationship dynamic is if you can work to make communication a safe thing. I find that for this particular attachment style pairing the most, the single best thing that you can learn to do effectively in this relationship is communicate healthily. If you can do this, the relationship can really work. Like if there's one focus area, it's got to be that. So the more there's that openness, that dialogue about what you're needing from one another, and then appreciating when you do see each other meeting those needs, that's where you're going to start to see a lot of momentum. And on the flip side, the dismissive avoidant, if you're the DA in the relationship, something that's really valuable is to add more transparency. Fearful avoidants feel a lot safer in relationships. Like if somebody, let's say a fearful avoidant and DA are dating, and the DA cancels plans at the last minute and they say, "Hey, sorry, I have to cancel tonight. Let's hang out soon." That's going to land differently than if a DA says to the fearful avoidant, "Hey, I have to cancel plans. I'm really feeling under the weather tonight. I'm hoping to feel better later this weekend. I'm really enjoying spending time with you. Let's make a plan for Tuesday." Like if there's transparency about why somebody cancels, what they're feeling when they cancel or change something, like if there's any transparency there, fearful avoidants can handle that very well. They're like going to make space for it. They're going to feel safe. They're going to feel comfortable. So the easier, the more transparency is there, the easier the relationship will be, and the more trust will be there. The less volatility that will be there. So that's really, really important. And then another dynamic is fearful avoidance when you need something. If you're a DA and you need something, you need space or you need to be understood about something, the more you're vulnerable, which I know is the scariest part for a dismissive avoidant, but the more that you're vulnerable, um, the easier of a time you're also going to have being heard and being understood. Fearful avoidants respond extremely well to vulnerability. If anybody has a fearful avoidant friend or partner, and if you, with the friend or partner, communicate really openly, you say, "Oh, I'm feeling a little worried about something or I'm feeling hurt by something." If you share what you're feeling, fearful avoidants respond extremely well to that. Fearful avoidants have a harder time listening to people and taking things in if they don't see the vulnerability. So that's a really important thing. And the last thing I'll say, there's honestly so much more to talk about in this dynamic. And I will do a follow up live stream at the end of November about this in more detail. We were kind of just doing a test run today. But just to see if this technology for streaming works well and everything. And I do have a whole course, by the way, too. It's called the Fearful Avoidant Dismissive Avoidant Relationship. And it's all of this. It's how to communicate. It's how to reprogram the core wounds, what the core wounds are, what the big fears are, how to overcome the fears. And we go through everything, the love languages of each person, what the relationship trajectory will look like and when to address certain things and how. There's tons of stuff, but you can check it out for free for 14 days. I'll actually post the link here for a 14-day trial if you'd like. We're going to do it for November, but you can have early access to it now. Let me just grab that for you as well. But essentially, the one of the most beautiful things, in my opinion, about all the different attachment style relationships that honestly I think is just so powerful and cool to see is that it just so happens that what every attachment style needs to do in the relationship with each other also happens to be exactly what that attachment style needs to do to heal. So, for example, you'll see like the DA to be with the fearful avoidant and make it work, they have to learn to be more vulnerable. They have to learn to communicate their needs. So does the fearful avoidant. And the fearful avoidant also with the DA needs to learn to communicate their boundaries. And this is how you make the relationship work. But it just so happens that these things are also exactly what each of them needs to do to heal themselves. So these relationships actually kind of force us to heal ourselves with each other. And that happens with everybody. That happens with APDA, that happens with APFA, exactly what each individual needs for the relationship to work also just happens to be what each individual uniquely needs for the most healing possible, which is really cool. So that'll be a topic for another conversation. I'm just going to answer one last question briefly here. I have a meeting coming up in 5 minutes. I posted that link if anybody wants that in the chat. It's supposed to not be till next month, but it's a sort of early access here, 14-day free trial now. But the last question I see here, I know there's quite a few, but I'm just trying to find one of them in here. So my avoidant partner is stonewalling me after I hurt him with my words. What should I do? From Oopsie Daisy. Hi, Oopsie Daisy. So one of the best things that you can do when this is happening is to number one, address it. Whenever there's stonewalling, the best thing to do as a fearful avoidant is to go. If you said you hurt him with your words, go address it. Say, hey, I know you're pulling away. I understand that I hurt you and what I said didn't feel good. Okay, so that's the first step, is to acknowledge it and to take accountability. DAs respond really well to overcoming conflict if they see somebody's ready to be accountable for their side. Oopsie daisy, you probably also were hurt by something. So you'll want to share, like, when you have the dialogue, what affected you as well, perhaps. But the second thing is DAs, why they shut down most often is because they have a big shame wound. So they feel very easily defective. And when we feel shame, if you ever notice what shame does, shame makes you want to hide. If you've ever felt embarrassed in front of people, have you ever had the experience of wanting to, like, run away, hide? So shame makes us withdraw really quickly. And so because DAs actually have a lot of shame in their attachment programming, they want to hide really, really badly. And so the stonewalling is self-protection, and it's hiding from shame. So if you can also counteract that with something, the opposite of shame is pride or acceptance. And acceptance goes a really long way with DAs. So you don't have to be like accepting about everything. You're allowed to have, needs that you have that may be different than what's happening in the relationship. But if you can say something you appreciate about your DA or something you accept about them, and then take accountability for your part and apologize, that's where you're actually going to see them bounce back the quickest. And then when they do bounce back from, the stonewalling, and also at the end, the third thing I would say, so take accountability, oppose the shame wound with something acknowledging or accepting about them that you appreciate. And then number three is tell them, say to your DA when you're being stonewalled, I know you may not be ready to talk right now, but it's also not healthy for us to just shut each other out. It's not going to resolve anything. So when you're ready, I'm ready to have a healthy conversation and set this to rest. And, if you say healthy conversation, let's make sure we don't stonewall, you're setting a good standard in the relationship as well going forward. And then when you do have the dialogue, if you were hurt by something as well, you can start by like acknowledging what they were feeling, addressing your stuff like you did in those three parts that we just mentioned. But then you can also say what affected you. If you were harsh with your words, I'm sure there was a reason that you were triggered by. And it's also going to be important that you gently acknowledge what that was as well. When this situation happened, whatever it was that you argued over. For me, what came up was feeling ABC. I felt hurt. I felt stressed. I felt frustrated. And here's what I needed. So as long as you're both talking about your feelings and needs and validating each other's feelings and having that needs discussion, using those three steps we just discussed, that will go a really long way to get out of the stonewalling dynamic. So hi, thank you everybody for coming in. I know there's so many people who have joined over the last hour or so. This was sort of just for anybody who's here. This was a test run. We're going to do a live at the end of next month, just all about the fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant dynamic. And then we'll, every couple months we'll do other versions of this with AP, FA, APDA, etc. So that will all be in here. This is being recorded. I see a couple of questions. So, you will be able to watch this back. And then the last thing I'll say is I put a link in the chat. I'll put it one more time. We're doing a 14-day free trial. It gives you access to the whole Fearful Avoidant DA course, but also to the DA AP course, the FA AP courses in PDS, and also these webinars that are live. We have a much smaller group than is in here now, and I do 3 of them a week. We technically do like 4 of them. And then we also have other coaches and counselors and facilitators who do another couple. So there's a live webinar almost every day with all sorts of different content. And we've got support groups daily, all those sorts of things. So if you ever want to come in the school and check it out, I would love to see you there. And I will put that link one last time, and really appreciate everybody for being here today, for tuning in. It was so nice to see everyone. And yeah, look forward to seeing you again. I'll have we're gonna go back, I think, to doing daily videos. We were testing some every other day videos out, but I think we'll have more daily videos going into November. We're gonna sort of see what goes on. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for all the really, really sweet comments and the kindness in here in the chat. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you all being here and following this channel. Really, really appreciate that because I love doing this. I love sharing. There's nothing I would love more than this, what I get to do for my career now. So appreciate you all being here to listen and ask questions and to learn. So I hope everybody has an amazing rest of their day. Thank you so, so much. And I will be back on here very soon. Bye, everybody. Thank you.